Good afternoon from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Ashley Fortune Isham, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series that's held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, or NCWSC, and they're located in Reston, Virginia. The NCWSC Climate Change Science and Management webinar series highlights their sponsored science projects related to climate change impacts and adaptation and aims to increase awareness and inform participants like you about potential and predicted climate change impacts on fish and wildlife. I'd like to welcome Dr. Sean Carter, Senior Scientist at NCWSC, to introduce our speaker. Sean, welcome.
Thanks, Ashley. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Shannon McNeely. She's an interdisciplinary social natural scientist at Colorado State University, and she serves as the co-lead for the adaptation science area of the North Central Climate Science Center. Her research focuses on climate variability and climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and adaptation of social and socio-ecological systems. Some of her previous work has addressed adaptive capacity of indigenous peoples in the remote rural interior region of Alaska, as well as drought-induced water scarcity and sustainability in the context of climate change in northwest Colorado. Shannon currently leads the NCCSC Drought Risk and Adaptation in the Interior project, as well as various tribal engagement projects, such as the Wind River Reservation on drought preparedness. Today, Shannon's going to be talking to us about co-producing science and tools for drought preparedness in the Wind River Reservation's tribal water managers. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Shannon. Welcome.
All right, thank you, Sean. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you all for listening today, and thank you to the coordinators for the opportunity to talk about this fun and exciting project at the Wind River Reservation for drought preparedness. My talk is going to cover some of the process and sort of framework for doing the co-production work with the tribes, and then some of the talk is going to cover some of the actual content of the technical assessment that we're doing with the tribes. So I'm located here at Colorado State University on the university side of the North Central Climate Science Center. This is a map of our region and the public lands within our region. So we do have a lot of public lands scientists and managers that we serve throughout the region, and part of that mandate is supporting tribes in climate adaptation. So this is one of the North Central Climate Science Center sponsored projects. And then this is just a map of the reservations in the region. So you get an idea. We have 31 federally recognized tribes and 1 state recognized tribe, and we do acknowledge that these are just the reservation boundaries. This isn't all the tribal lands, and certainly not all the indigenous people and organizations that are outside of the reservation boundaries. So I'm going to see, okay, so my pointer's a little wonky, but getting over here. So today we're going to focus on, can you see that? Can you see my pointer? Yeah, okay. So today we're going to focus on the Wind River Reservation, which is here in Wyoming. It's the only reservation in Wyoming. It's the home of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes. There are about 26,000 plus people who live at Wind River Reservation. It's a 2.2 million acre reservation, so rather large, 7th largest in the United States based on land mass and 5th in population. The tribal membership is a little over 10,000 of the Northern Arapaho and about 4,300 and some change of the Eastern Shoshone. And the Eastern Shoshone tribe is the treaty tribe of the reservation, and then the Northern Arapaho were moved there later in the 1870s. So this is a more detailed map of the Wind River Reservation. It's characterized by mountainous region over here in the western portion, so alpine and subalpine, and then as you move west it gets much drier, more arid, sort of sagebrush steppe largely ecosystem in that area. So drought is a big concern for the reservation. They've seen several very severe droughts in recent decades. affecting water availability, which affects almost everything at the reservation, such as reservoir management, tribal agriculture, mainly ranching, and fish and wildlife, among other things. So we are working very closely with the Tribal Water Engineers Office and the Wind River Water Resources and Control Board to work on this project of drought preparedness. So the project has kind of three main overarching components to it. One is the drought risk technical assessment, which is where the USGS funding is coming through the climate science centers. The second is capacity building and monitoring, and the third is drought planning. So to give you a little bit more detail of what each of these three components entail, one is social science interviews and fieldwork, primarily to date focusing on water managers and some of the producers on the reservation about drought risks and responses, and also to document local knowledge and observations to inform the rest of the science and planning activities. So we're doing this integrated assessment of drought vulnerability, which includes the social vulnerability assessment, physical climate assessment, and hydroclimatological assessment from past to the future, and then looking at ecosystems impacts and responses. The third component is this capacity building and training. We are working with them to develop a quarterly climate and drought summary as a decision support tool for the water managers and others at the reservation. We've been doing training for the staff of the Tribal Water Engineers Office, and then youth and adult water and drought educational activities. And I'll get into more detail about each of these. I'm just giving sort of the high-level overview first. As I mentioned, drought planning. The overall target for the project is a reservation-wide drought plan. And this, of course, will be informed closely by the technical assessment. And then lastly, we also have a project evaluation that's happening to look at both the process of the research as well as the outputs and outcomes of the research to make sure that we are doing usable and actionable science for the managers. So a summary of the project activities to date. The sort of genesis of the project started in the spring of 2014 when we started working on the proposal with the tribes. This went through the summer into the fall when the proposals were due in 2014. This included many visits by myself to Wind River Reservation to build those relationships and really work closely with them to make sure that we were designing the project from the beginning in a way that they wanted. As I mentioned, the Wind River Reservation Climate and Drought Summary, which I'll show later, we've produced 7 with them to date. So the last one was just released, I think it was last month. We've had a series of workshops at the reservation with the scientists and the managers and producers and other stakeholders. There will have been 5 as of the end of July. The next one is happening next week. And then I mentioned the training for the tribal water technicians. We, with some support from NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, drought.gov, we have sent them to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln to work with the National Drought Mitigation Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center to train them on the data and the science that goes into the creation of the climate and drought summary, with the idea that ultimately the production of that summary will transfer to the tribes. And then, as I mentioned, the in-depth interviews with water managers have been going on during 2014 through 2015, and to date, I've done 20 of those interviews. So the technical assessment leadership is a combination of scientists across disciplines and tribal members and managers. So you can see on the outside, the two leads of the project are Cody Knudsen at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the National Drought Mitigation Center, and then myself here at CSU. On the top level are the tribal partners, Gary Collins, who is the former tribal water engineer, Mitch Cottonor, who's the current tribal water engineer, and Al Seabearing, who's kind of the point of contact for the project and one of the water technicians in the tribal water engineer's office. On the bottom level, you have the other team leads and PIs, Mark Svoboda at the National Drought Mitigation Center, Imtiaz Ranwala at CU Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, and NOAA, and then Jennifer Wellman, who is a hydrologist who is the Wind River, Wyoming EPSCoR local scientist and coordinator. So this slide has a lot on it. I don't really expect you to be able to read everything, but the point is to show that there are a lot of other collaborators and partners across the tribe, across the reservation, the tribes, I mean, and various agencies and universities. We are leveraging a whole lot of human power and funding for this project beyond just the North Central Climate Science Center. At the bottom are the acronyms of all the various agencies and universities involved. You can see at the core here is the agency, the organizations of the Wind River Indian Reservation who have some stake in water management and drought or the impacts of drought. And then this is the core project management team on the next level. And then we have a local technical advisory group with folks from the different tribal departments and various agencies, federal agencies. And then we have this broader team of technical support and project collaborators at the top. So how are we doing the science integration? This follows our North Central Climate Science Center framework for doing management-driven science. Again, you can see at the center is the Wind River Indian Reservation and the Tribal Water Engineer's Office, Water Board, and the business councils. And then we have our science team broken up into the different disciplinary sort of groups of the center, which is the physical climate team and hydroclimate experts, the ecological impacts here, and then at the bottom is the human vulnerability and adaptation. And the team leads are in black, so you can see who those are. Mark Svoboda and Imtiaz Ranwala for the physical climate team, Jennifer Wellman for the ecological impacts team, and myself and Cody Knudsen for the social science team. Each team has monthly calls, and then periodically we have all hands calls and webinars to share across teams, and we pretty much always have someone or multiple people represented from the tribes as well who participate in those calls. So I mentioned the Wind River Climate and Drought Summary. This is the decision support tool that we've been working on with them to help them with implementing their tribal water code and their 15 beneficial and equal uses of water in their tribal water code, in which they have to make decisions and declarations about water availability at the reservation, whether it's surplus, normal, or drought conditions there. This is actually a picture of the first summary that was released back in, spring of 2015, March of 2015. We've been trying to work with them to time these with their decision calendar for when they need to make these decisions. And these are the culmination of many, many months of meetings and calls and workshops and emails and on and on. But again, this is very much a co-produced tool. As I mentioned earlier, we've released the 7th one just last month. The URL is at the bottom where you can find those at the Tribal Water Engineer's Office at Wind River. I don't think the 7th one is up yet, at least last I looked. And then through the social science methods and our collaborative approach for co-production, this also informs the technical assessment and vice versa, and making sure that all of the work that we're doing is culturally sensitive, relevant, and usable for the managers. And as I mentioned, the goal is ultimately to transfer the production of this summary to the water technicians themselves, which they have started contributing to these summaries over the last couple. So we are also testing some new tools and doing a variety of physical climate analyses. This is what's referred to as the EDDI, the Evaporative Drought Demand Index. You can see there that it's overlaid with the map of the Wind River Reservation and the Wind River Basin, as well as the larger Bighorn Basin that the Wind River is part of. Basically, what the EDDI does is it calculates drought based on atmospheric thirst. And this actually is a tool that seems to work very, very well for monitoring and for projecting drought in an early warning system. We did some ground truthing with this tool last summer, and it seemed to perform very, very well. We had a workshop with the water managers where we got their direct feedback on what the EDDI was saying at various time points throughout the 2015 irrigation season and what they were observing on the ground, and there seemed to be a pretty good match. So we're pretty excited about the possibility of this tool. It actually performed even better at this scale than the National Drought Monitor. So we're working with the National Drought Mitigation Center, of course, to look at how these tools can inform each other to better provide early warning systems for drought. So we're still in somewhat of an early phase of some of the technical assessment. This kind of, the trade-off of doing this type of a co-production with all this, large amount of collaborators is that it moves a little bit more slowly. So we're kind of just getting the ball rolling in terms of some of the analysis and output that's being done. As I mentioned, we have a workshop at Wind River next week, so we're going to start getting some feedback on this. So this is our, like I said, this is part of our physical climate team. These are the folks that are in Boulder at CU Boulder and NOAA. And I'm just going to give a couple of quick examples of some of the analysis that we're starting to look at, and just kind of the more simple look so it doesn't get too terribly complicated, just to give a sort of a flavor and a lens into some of the things that we're doing and how we're going about it. So this is a snowpack and glacier-fed system. So the timing, quantity, and quality of snowpack and runoff are key determinants in terms of water availability and drought risk at the reservation. So this is, again, just one of the many variables that we're looking at, but this is a really important one when working with the local decision makers, and because they are so snowpack dependent and runoff dependent for their management. And so we're starting off by looking at snow-tell sites to put this into the historical context, combined with, again, the information that we're gleaning from the interviews to put it in the local context and local observations. So we're looking at snow-tell sites basin-wide throughout the Wind River Basin, combined with those local workshops and input through our workshops and webinars. So this is one of the analyses that's happening with Imtiaz and his group. Snow-tell doesn't tell you how much of the precipitation falls as rain versus snow. So we have to do an estimate, and this issue of precipitation falling as rain versus snow is an important one. This is because the climate models are projecting for this region that it's very likely that we're going to see a shift in precipitation falling as rain and snow, and that makes a difference in terms of timing and amount of runoff, because if more precipitation falls as rain than as snow, you don't have that snow melt that is taking you through the irrigation season to the end of the summer and early fall. So what this is looking at is an equation to look at the combination of SWE, which is snow water equivalent, precipitation, and temperature, and look at these trends to estimate the difference of what's falling as rain versus what's falling as precipitation. And then we're looking at these various drought years, and here we mentioned 2015 versus the mean. 2000 was an interesting year in terms of this rain versus snow equation, and I will get back to that in more detail later. But essentially, trying to answer this question, are we already seeing a shift from precipitation falling as rain versus snow? We don't have the answers yet, but that's what we're working on. And so we are looking at these SOTEL sites throughout the region, but then also working with the managers to hone in on specific sites that are of particular importance to them for their management. So the station at Hobbs Park right here is one that's particularly important because this is the station that they use to try and understand dynamics in the Little Wind River Basin. The Little Wind River Basin is where the majority of tribal communities and producers live, and the majority of where the TWE focuses, the Tribal Water Engineers Office, because it is where they experience water shortages a lot on the reservation. There are large areas of the reservations with non-Indian producers and other managers such as the Bureau of Reclamation who impounds a lot of the water up in Boyson Reservoir and Bull Lake over here. So this whole system on the Big Wind River is actually managed by the Bureau of Reclamation and a lot of non-Indian producers in that region. So Hobbs Park is at about a little bit over 10,000 feet, and some of the output, again, this isn't all, but this is just to give you a flavor, is looking at, again, this estimate between precipitation, real precipitation records versus estimated, and rain versus snow. Again, like I mentioned, the SOTEL sites do not tell you how much precipitation has fallen as rain versus snow. So the solid blue line is the total recorded precipitation versus the estimated, which are the dashes. And so what you're seeing here is that there is a pretty good matchup between the what on my screen looks like a mustardy sort of colored line, which is the maximum snow water equivalent, and the estimated snowfall, meaning that most of the precipitation is falling as snow versus rain, which is the green line. And because those lines match up pretty well, the estimated versus the actual recorded, it means that this algorithm is working pretty well. So what we're also doing is taking the information from the interviews in terms of when people have experienced some of the most severe droughts at the reservation and comparing that to the drought indicators and climate data. So this is just one slide that shows you some of the different years that came out in the interviews as being important drought impacts. Again, I'll just point out that one of the years is 2015, this line here, which on the surface doesn't appear to be a drought year. However, that issue of rain versus snow and the timing of that is important. So again, I'll come back to that again later. So I also mentioned part of our physical climate team is at the National Drought Mitigation Center. So Mark Svoboda is the lead in that, and here's some of his collaborators. So we're working with them to look at a variety of drought indicators and evaluating them in the local context. Again, all of this will be presented next week at the reservation to get feedback from our stakeholders in this iterative co-production process. Just another sample output. Again, this is kind of draft. All of this is draft data. None of this is final output. As I mentioned, we're kind of in the early to middle stages of this. But this is just another example of an output looking at the SPI, the Standard Precipitation Impact Index, in the counties that are in the Wind River Reservation. And so this comes from, a lot of this data from the National Drought Mitigation Center is now in their Drought Risk Atlas. So here's the URL right here. It's a relatively new tool that has a lot of different drought indicator data that you can pull up and look at in a whole variety of temporal and spatial scales. So it's a really good tool to know about if you haven't seen that yet. But what we're trying to understand and work with the managers is asking, this question, what's your risk at any given threshold? In other words, this is a 6-month SPI, and you can see here anything that falls kind of below the -2 is a pretty significant drought. Mark says, -1, he would expect people to start seeing impacts. You can see some pretty big droughts here in the mid-2000s, in 2012, 2013. Again, these are ones that people talked about a lot in the interviews, so we can really get detailed information on what happened on the ground, what did people observe, what was impacted, and what were the management issues related to it. And then ultimately, how can we as a team help you with better data and information so that you can manage these impacts better? The black lines are actually, just a quick note, this is again kind of an experiment. These are from the Drought Impacts Reporter, which is on the National Drought Mitigation Center site. These are people, some sort of citizen science, people going in and actually logging impacts. Others are media reports. Others are from COCO-RAS, the Community Rain, Hail, and Snow Monitoring Network. And there's a bit of a lag time because I think they just put these in at January instead of when they actually entered them. So again, looking at different time scales, a 12-month SPI versus a 6-month SPI, and understanding different phenomenon in these different time scales, such as impacts to growing season versus time periods of importance for fish and wildlife management versus vegetation for cultural or ceremonial purposes, just to name a few. And again, putting these into the context of regional drought trends, especially since the early 2000s, when they have seen a series of extreme drought conditions, as we have in the larger sort of western portion of the U.S. So I mentioned the year 2015. This is one of the things that we're actually starting to write up as a collaborative across the various science teams to do an interdisciplinary integrated paper on what we're calling a microdrought, meaning a drought that's short in duration and highly localized. As I showed, it didn't look like much of a drought if you just look at the basic indicator data for 2015. But what happened on the ground was they had low snowpack by January. By March and April, snowpack was very, very low, 56% of normal. So they were getting really worried about the irrigation season. And then anyone who lives in this region will remember in May, we just got a deluge. It poured cats and dogs. But this was rain, not snow. And so the reservoirs filled, but they had to release a lot of that water. They had to release it because there's only so much storage capacity in the Little Wind River system in Washakie Reservoir. This is part of the challenge in that system is they just don't have a lot of storage. I think Washakie is about 8,000 acre feet. Yep, it says right there at the bottom. And so what happened was by the beginning of August, they started to run out of water. Why? Because they didn't have that snowpack that was releasing that later season water. So by about mid-August, they basically had to end the irrigation season, a season which normally goes till about the beginning of October, sometimes even later, depending on what's going on with the season. They had a lot of backlash from local producers who didn't quite understand the dynamics that had happened and were very, very upset that they were cut off because, of course, this hurts their production and their livelihoods. But this is the reality that the Tribal Water Engineer's Office was dealing with, is that they just didn't have enough storage and they just didn't have enough snowpack, and that precipitation falling as rain later in the season versus falling as snow earlier in the season is what really hurt them. So now I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Part of my role here at the North Central Climate Science Center, I do a lot of tribal engagement, and I've been working with tribes for a very long time. So I see part of my role as sort of helping other scientists and agency folks who want to work with tribes and don't maybe have the experience to understand a little bit better how to work in Indian country, although you really have to have the experience to know how. But these are just some of my lessons that I've learned in my work, both at Wind River Reservation and my longer term work for about 15 years now with tribes on climate change issues. First and foremost, the importance of focusing on relationships and trust is paramount. I mentioned during the summer and fall of 2014, I spent a lot of time going up to the reservation, working with them, building those relationships and trust, working on the proposal, etc. Trust takes a lot of work and isn't easily gained because of the failures of our predecessors and some contemporaries. And so you really have to work hard at it. And it's the foundation of everything else. And by the way, a lot of these lessons are lessons for working with stakeholders more broadly, but they're particularly important when working with tribes. Secondly, again, especially in the beginning, do a lot of listening and learning. I see so much value from this work in learning from the local context and learning from them and their knowledge of their environment and their climate and their weather. So it's a two-way street. It's actually a multi-way street. But culturally, you'll get a lot more respect if you do a lot of listening as opposed to a lot of teaching, so to speak, and trying to impress people with your own knowledge. People are much more impressed by your character than your knowledge. Third, respect culture and cultural and local knowledge, and incorporate local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge to the best of your ability. It's really important to understand and respect local practices, taboos, language, etc., and do what you can to incorporate local knowledge to the extent possible. Focus on early deliverables. This is really important for this project. We, in the beginning, before we even started writing the proposal, we sat down with them and asked them the question, what is it you need now, and how can we help you now? Because it's going to take a while to write this proposal, it's going to take a while to get the funding, it's going to take a while to put everything in place, do the assessment, do the planning, but what is it that we can help you with now? And that was when the idea was to do the summary and do some trainings. They had learned about everything that was going on at Navajo Nation, actually, and Hopi Nation, and wanted to do something similar to those summaries that they were putting out. So we started working on that very early, and as I mentioned, had the first climate and drought summary out before we had the funding for the technical assessment. And again, this was through leveraging a lot of other resources. NIDIS helped a lot at that point, the National Drought Mitigation Center, the High Plains Regional Climate Center, and the North Central Climate Science Center. Fifth, make sure the co-production is end-to-end, like I mentioned, starting with collaboration on the proposal development, including putting funding in for the tribes themselves. I've seen many times over people who want to work with tribes, but they don't have any funding to support the tribes, and that's a recipe for failure, in my opinion. It's really, really important to make sure that the funding is in there for the tribes themselves. On the Wind River project, we have funding for our tribal co-PIs and partners to actually participate in the research and participate in the whole project. 6 is work out a protocol for managing and sharing data and information. This is extremely important. This gets into a whole bunch of issues with tribal intellectual property rights. Tribes run the spectrum in terms of their openness or being more closed about their own intellectual property, their TEK, etc. And so it's really important to make sure that you have an understanding of where the various tribes sit on that spectrum, and to the extent possible, if they don't already have a research protocol, get one in place. It's actually something that I've done with different tribes that I've worked with, is helping them, if they don't already have one, to develop their own tribal research protocol. We did this for the Wind River tribes, and so it helps guide us in terms of not only the data and the information sharing itself, but also the process, how we go about the co-production, how we go about the process of research and communicating and sharing information, and who we need to get the authority from, et cetera, et cetera. Find ways for regular communication, but respect people's time. As I mentioned, we have these monthly calls and periodic all-hands calls and workshops, et cetera. We've been really fortunate in that we've had a lot of participation from Wind River Reservation, but at the same time, you have to understand these people are running a nation, so to speak, and the people that work for the tribes are often carrying an enormous burden and have a lot of pressure on their time. So just being really flexible about, inviting them to whatever they can make it, but if they don't, not taking it personally and not worrying about it, because they do have a lot of demands on their time, as we all do. But 8 is let go of expectations, and I don't mean have no expectations, because of course you want to have goals and objectives and all of that, but acknowledging that you're operating in a different culture, in a different worldview and way of life and practices and all of those things. Sometimes you go out to these remote locations and things don't happen the way you expected them to, and that's okay, because oftentimes what does end up happening ends up being really productive for the project. And so just, again, sort of having that flexibility and that understanding that things aren't always going to go the way we as, Western scientists would like them to go. And then lastly, I always think it's a good idea to find ways to give back to the community, especially with the students and the elders. Things like doing educational programs. One of the things I've done is, helping tribes with interviewing their elders and creating their or contributing to their tribal archives. So any way that you can help and give back by doing that and bring them into the projects as well is always a really good thing to do. So that's it. That's all I have to say today. So I guess we can open it up for questions or comments.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much, Shannon.
And this is, while we're waiting for questions to come in, this is Jeff Morset with the North Central Climate Science Center, just to kind of note my appreciation for Shannon's dedication to kind of those lessons learned from tribes. She's worked with beyond just the Wind River, several tribes and tribal organizations throughout the North Central, and I just want to kind of give kudos to the dedication and attention she pays to those nuances that are not always easy. This is not exactly what counts in the academic review for your productivity or scholarship. So Shannon has had a lot of effort and dedication to it. We really rely on her at the North Central to give us some guidance and the kind of cultural norms to work with tribes. So just hats off to her for doing that, and I appreciate people listening to it, because I think it is built on a lot of experience that she's had.
Thanks. While we wait for a BIA-funded tribal liaison, which we've kind of been waiting for, to have an actual tribal person on staff to help with all those things. But in the meantime, I help out with that.
So we had a question come in, and it says, for all climate science centers and academics working with tribes, might the North Central Climate Science Center develop a white paper or outline to share aspects of the research protocol and processes that you've developed, as this is one of the most critical, but often not in place and not adapted well as circumstances change and researchers and partners change, requiring updates over time?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I really do appreciate that comment. We've actually been talking about this. I've been, we meaning actually a broader community of people who do this work, Indigenous peoples and climate change work. Kyle White and I are working on a paper with Valerie Small, who on this topic, more focused on vulnerability assessment. That's the intention for that, is to be more of a peer-reviewed article. We've talked about doing something on this very topic for the National Adaptation Forum that's happening in May of 2017 in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm actually on the steering committee for the National Adaptation Forum and the Equity Working Group, and I was just at Rising Voices Conference on Indigenous Peoples and Climate Change, and this topic came up in one of our breakouts about this need that you point to. So whether or not that's a white paper, I think that's a great idea. I think we can talk about that here, maybe doing something like that. You know, we talked about training sessions, maybe various ideas. But yeah, you're right. It is an important need. So thanks for the comment.
And then the next question comes from Amber, and it says, thanks for the presentation, Shannon. I'm very impressed by your effort and your collaborators that you have put into the two-way conversation with the Wind River tribal community. I'm wondering, was there much interest in long-term climate forecasts, such as 20, 50, and 100 years, among the communities that you worked with?
Yeah, so again, this is something that has come up a lot, well, not a lot, some, and we are doing climate projections as part of the assessment. I didn't mention that's one of the many aspects that the physical climate team is working on. Imtiaz Rangwala, again, is the lead on that. He has asked the question about what the best time frame for projections would be, so we're still kind of iterating on that. I actually asked him for our workshop next week to put some of this rain versus snow conversation into the context of the climate projections, as well as some of the other climate assessment. So the answer is yes, that we're doing that, and there is interest, but we're still working through exactly what, when, and how. But the goal of the project is to go as far into the past as we can and as far into the future as we can, or is wanted, is relevant. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Shannon. Amber just responded, and she says, thanks for the answer. I'm most curious to know what the tribal community themselves are interested in. On what timescales they make decisions. We would like to hear more about your work in the future. Okay, so a couple different answers to that, to the specifics of that question. One is just the basic question of asking, you know, how far into the future should we do the projections? I think, not surprisingly, the answer was the shortest amount. So I think, you know, Imtiaz gave the option of, I think it was 2025, you know, 2050, 2070, and the response was, you know, whatever the soonest is, 2025. That's common. I hear that all the time in, you know, not just with tribes, but any managers. With that said, there are a couple other things that I didn't mention that are going on in tandem at Wind River Reservation that we are also interacting with and informing, and vice versa. One of those is a water storage feasibility study
That study was funded by the state of Wyoming and had some consultants working on it, and they're looking at various locations across the reservation for future storage, given the fact that they currently have water shortages in some parts of the reservation. They also have wet rights as part of their water adjudication, as part of the Bighorn adjudication, meaning for people who aren't paper rights. For people who aren't familiar with that term, about half of their settlement came in the form of wet rights, in other words, water that they can use today, and about half of their settlement came in the form of future rights in terms of future use and production. So I can't give you a specific time frame, but you do know that, when creating storage sites and looking at future production, you need to have future, or you should have future projections. The storage study commissioned by the state did not include a climate analysis, so we're hoping that perhaps at the very least our assessment can inform that storage study and what they do with that storage study, or perhaps we do a future assessment that incorporates the storage feasibility with climate projections. And that would be more like, probably 30, 50-year time frames. Or maybe even more given how long it takes to actually build storage and get storage wet. The other thing that's happening in tandem is they're working on their agricultural resource management plan as part of the Agricultural Resource Management Act. So they got funding from the BIA to do an agricultural resource management planning process. So that's another activity where they're thinking about looking out into the future and what that might look like in terms of tribal producers and other producers on the reservation and water needs and all of that. So this is going to be a component of that. Again, I don't have an exact date in terms of how far out that might mean, but again, this is part of the ongoing iteration. In part, this is going to be part of our discussion next week at the reservation. So stay tuned.
Thanks, Shannon. And then the folks at the South Central Climate Science Center, Mike, Kim, Aaron, Kim, and April, made mention in the chat that they have a guidance document that's being drafted at the South Central Climate Science Center, and it's on working in Indian country. And they're going to share it in the next couple months, but the focus is building relationships between researchers and tribal communities. And there's some of the key themes mentioned here. And also, they're thinking it will be interesting to compare working with different tribes in different parts of the country, too.
Mm-hmm. Great. Look forward to seeing that. And I'll just say in the interim that, like I said, at the Rising Voices conference, we talked about the importance of this issue meaning working in Indian country, tribal engagement of agencies and indigenous peoples, not only the CSCs, but of course, the other agencies and entities that do tribal engagement. So if you guys at the South Central are interested in working on a session together for the National Adaptation Forum, I'd be happy to work on that with you guys and bring in some of the other folks that we were having this conversation with at Rising Voices, indigenous peoples at Rising Voices. The call for session proposals is going to be released August 8th, so keep an eye out for that. I'm not sure when the due date is going to be, but that is when they are going to put the solicitation out.
And that's going to be in May of 2017, correct? The National Adaptation Forum?
That's right. Yeah, and there's been a pretty strong indigenous component so this is the third National Adaptation Forum. The first two had a lot of sessions on indigenous peoples and climate change adaptation. I think there's probably going to be a pretty good turnout again this year. And I mentioned I'm on the equity working group for the National Adaptation Forum, and so that's equity broadly, not just Indigenous peoples, but less advantaged communities and people of color, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, they have some big issues on their mind in St. Paul that aren't Indigenous peoples, but I've been really advocating to try and get more engagement with Indigenous peoples across the forum, so it's not just a siloed session series as it kind of has been in the past. That's some of the feedback I've actually heard from Indigenous people who have participated in past National Adaptation Forums. So I'm at least trying to advocate to bring in more Indigenous involvement more broadly across the forum, including reaching out more to tribes in the area, in Minnesota and in the region. So we'll see how well that goes.
Excellent, thank you. And then the South Central was just commenting that as the climate science centers and other agencies try to operate like a network, hopefully this will help everyone as they enter in Indian country and, just compare notes down the road. So, because every tribal culture and issues are different. All right, well, we're just past 4 o'clock. I'm not seeing anybody else typing or any other hands raised. So I'd like to extend a very warm thank you to Shannon for presenting today. It was a wonderful presentation and a lot of good discussion afterwards. So, and thank you to the South Central Climate Center as well as NISQUIS. Thank you.